Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're tackling something you probably encounter every day, but maybe haven't thought too deeply about. Sugar.
Yeah, sugar. It's in so much of what we eat and drink.
Exactly. But behind those little white crystals lies a surprisingly complex and, frankly, pretty dark history. We're going to unravel that history, tracing sugar's journey from its humble origins as a plant to its role as a global commodity that shaped empires, fueled economies, and, unfortunately, even driven some of humanity's worst acts.
It's a story that's both fascinating and at times really disturbing.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, let's imagine ourselves way back in time, about 8,000 BCE in New Guinea. This is where sugarcane, the source of our sugar, was first domesticated.
Now, back then, it was all about simplicity. We're talking about people chewing on sugarcane stalks to enjoy that natural sweetness.
No fancy processing or refining, just pure, raw sugarcane.
Right. Quite a contrast to the refined white sugar we're used to today.
Huge difference. Now let's fast forward a few thousand years to India, around 400 to 350 BCE. This is where things start to get interesting, because this is when we see the first evidence of humans developing techniques to process sugarcane.
They figured out how to boil and crystallize the juice, essentially creating the earliest forms of sugar as we know it.
So this was the aha moment, the innovation that set everything in motion.
Precisely. But even then, sugar wasn't something you'd find on everyone's table.
It wasn't an everyday ingredient.
Not at all. In India, sugar held a very special status. It was primarily used in religious ceremonies and rituals.
Oh, interesting. So it was more like a sacred offering.
Exactly. It was seen as a symbol of purity and often used as an offering to the gods. And even today, you see this legacy in many cultures where sweets play a significant role in religious festivals and celebrations.
I never thought about that connection before. So how did sugar spread beyond India? How did it make its way to other parts of the world?
Well, as with many things in history, trade played a key role. The Islamic Empire, with its vast trade networks spanning from Asia to Europe, became a major catalyst in spreading sugar westward.
So imagine those ancient trade routes bustling with merchants carrying all sorts of exotic goods, and among them is this newly prized sugar.
And by 986 CE, we have records of sugar making its grand entrance into Europe. Specifically, it entered through Venice, which is a major hub for trade at that time.
Makes sense. Venice was known for its merchants and its connections to the East.
Exactly. But even in Europe, sugar was initially a luxury item. It was expensive and hard to come by, so only the wealthy elite could afford it.
I can picture those Venetian merchants showcasing this rare and exotic ingredient to the aristocracy,
Yeah.
sparking their curiosity and their desire for something new and luxurious.
Absolutely. It was a status symbol, for sure. And, Europeans found some pretty creative uses for it. During the Black Death, for example, sugar was actually considered a medicine.
Really? A medicine? That's surprising. What do they think it cured?
Well, the science of medicine back then was, shall we say, a bit different from today. Sugar was used for all sorts of ailments, from cough to digestive problems.
I guess they didn't know about the potential downsides of too much sugar back then.
Not at all. They also used sugar as a preservative to help keep food from spoiling. And, get this, they even used it as an elaborate decoration for food displays.
Wow. Decorations made of sugar. That's pretty extravagant.
It was. Imagine towering structures made of sugar gracing the tables of the wealthy.
Quite a contrast to how we use sugar today. So sugar's journey had already taken some interesting twists and turns, but then comes a pivotal moment, Columbus's voyages to the Americas in the late 15th century.
Ah, yes. Columbus and his voyages. This marks a major turning point in the story of sugar. And sadly, not for the better.
Because this is when sugarcane is introduced to the Caribbean.
Precisely. In 1493, on his second voyage, Columbus brought sugarcane to the islands.
And sugarcane thrived in that tropical climate, right?
It did. Sugarcane flourished in the Caribbean, and unfortunately, that's where things take a darker turn. European powers, eager to capitalize on this new source of sugar, quickly established plantations throughout the region.
And as we know, those plantations relied on a horrific system of forced labor.
Yes. At first, they exploited both the indigenous population and African slaves for labor, a tragic foreshadowing of the horrors that were to come.
This brings us to one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Atlantic system and the rise of the transatlantic slave trade.
As the demand for sugar exploded in Europe, fueled by new trends like coffee, tea, and chocolate, the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil expanded rapidly throughout the 1500s.
And this insatiable appetite for sugar, this desire for sweetness, is what drove the horrific expansion of the slave trade.
It's a direct link. To meet the immense labor demands of these plantations, European powers turned to the brutal practice of enslaving Africans and transporting them across the Atlantic in absolutely horrific conditions.
That journey, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare of suffering and cruelty.
It was inhumane, the ships were overcrowded, disease was rampant, and countless people died during the voyage.
It's hard to fathom the scale of the suffering, the sheer number of lives lost or destroyed because of this trade.
It's a staggering tragedy, and it's all connected to something we often take for granted: sugar. It's a stark reminder that even the things we enjoy every day can have a hidden cost, a past that's far from sweet.
So, with this demand for sugar and the expansion of plantations in the Americas, we see the emergence of a triangular trade route, the Atlantic system.
Exactly. It was a system driven by greed and exploitation, where human lives were treated as mere commodities to fuel the sugar industry. And it's important to understand how the system worked.
Can you break it down for us?
It's essentially a three-way exchange. Europe sent manufactured goods, like textiles and weapons, to Africa.
And in return,
Tragically, Africa supplied enslaved Africans to the Americas.
and the Americas.
The Americas sent sugar, tobacco, and later cotton back to Europe. It's a cycle of exploitation and profit, with human lives at the center of it.
And the conditions on these plantations, from what I've read, were absolutely brutal.
They were. Enslaved people were forced to work tirelessly under the scorching sun, enduring unimaginable hardships and cruelty. It's crucial to remember the human cost behind every spoonful of sugar that was sweetening European tables.
A heartbreaking reality. And this leads us to another dark concept: new slavery. What distinguishes this form of slavery from others throughout history?
What sets new slavery apart is its deeply racialized and hereditary nature. Africans were enslaved based solely on the color of their skin, a horrific system justified by racial prejudice.
So, unlike previous forms of slavery, which might have been based on debt or capture during war, this was permanent and passed down through generations. There was little or no hope of freedom.
Exactly. It was a system designed to dehumanize and exploit an entire group of people based solely on their race. And it's a stark contrast to earlier forms of slavery, which were often temporary and not based on race.
So, as sugar became increasingly popular in Europe, the means of producing it became even more horrific and inhumane. It's a chilling contrast.
Sadly, yes. The demand for sugar continued to rise, driven by those new beverages we talked about earlier: tea, coffee, and chocolate. These drinks were all the rage, and sugar was the key ingredient that made them irresistible.
It seems that sugar's popularity was growing at an alarming rate.
It was, and this is where we see sugar making a major shift. It goes from being a luxury good to a staple food item. The price of sugar started to drop, making it accessible to the lower classes.
So it wasn't just for the wealthy elite anymore.
Exactly. And we even have some mind-blowing statistics from this period. For example, British sugar consumption skyrocketed by a staggering 2,500%.
That's incredible. So sugar went from a rare treat to a common part of the European diet.
Precisely. And that shift, that increased accessibility and affordability, is really what set the stage for sugar's role in modern society. It became deeply ingrained in our diets and our economies.
It's incredible to think about how something we consider so ordinary today had such a profound and complex impact on history.
It's a reminder that the things we encounter every day, even something as simple as sugar, can have a rich and often hidden history behind them.
And that's what we're here to uncover. We've covered a lot of ground so far, but there's still much more to explore. When we return, we'll delve deeper into sugar's evolution, from the abolition of slavery to its role in the Industrial Revolution and beyond. Stay with us.
It's a journey you won't want to miss. Welcome back. Before we jump into what happened after slavery was abolished, we need to rewind a bit. Remember those trade routes that brought sugar to Europe? Well, those routes are actually a product of another big historical event, the Age of Exploration.
Right. Sugar traveled across continents, so understanding those trade routes is key.
Exactly. Imagine Europe back in the 15th century, a place buzzing with curiosity and ambition. Countries like Portugal and Spain were desperate to find new sea routes to Asia. Why?
Because Asia had all the good stuff, right?
Yeah.
Spices and silks and all that.
Exactly. Spices, silk, porcelain, things Europeans were crazy for. But there was a problem. The Ottoman Empire controlled the land routes to Asia, making trade really expensive and difficult.
So these European countries were thinking, there's got to be a better way.
Exactly. They turned to the sea, looking for new ways to reach the east. Portugal, especially, took the lead. They had a guy, Prince Henry the Navigator, who was obsessed with exploration.
Feels like my kind of guy.
He poured money into new sailing tech and better maps. He even started a whole school for navigation.
Wow, a navigation school. That's dedication.
And it paid off. By the mid-1400s, Portuguese sailors had reached places like Cape Verde and Madeira. Then, in 1488, Bartolomeu Dias did something amazing. He rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope.
That was a big deal, right? It proved you could sail around Africa to get to the Indian Ocean.
Huge! Then, just a few years later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama took it even further. He sailed from Portugal all the way to India.
Direct sea route to the east.
Bingo! They bypassed the Ottoman Empire entirely and could finally get those spices directly.
I bet Portugal was thrilled.
Oh, yeah. They dominated the spice trade, becoming a real powerhouse. But of course, Spain wasn't just going to sit there and watch.
Competition is fierce. What did they do?
Spain wanted their own route to Asia. That's where Christopher Columbus comes in. He thought he could sail west across the Atlantic and reach the east that way.
Bold move.
The Spanish monarchs backed him, and in 1492, off he went. But, as we know, he found something else entirely.
The Americas. A whole new continent.
Exactly. And now, Spain and Portugal both had these huge areas they wanted to control. Things could have gotten messy.
So what did they do? Fight over it?
They actually did something pretty smart. They signed a treaty in 1494 called the Treaty of Tordesillas. Imagine a line drawn down the middle of a world map. That's basically what they did.
Splitting the world in half.
It sounds crazy, right? But it worked. Spain got everything west of the line, which included most of the Americas, and Portugal got the east, including their route around Africa to Asia.
And Brazil. Don't forget Brazil.
Right, Portugal got Brazil too. So what happened next? Well, Portugal, with their eastern route, focused on building trading posts from Africa to Asia. They were all about that spice trade.
And Spain. They were all about the Americas, weren't they?
You got it. They set up colonies, took advantage of all the resources, and developed those plantation economies we talked about, where sugar unfortunately became so central.
So we see how these two empires, driven by their desire for trade and expansion, really set the stage for the development of the Atlantic system and all its consequences.
Exactly. It's a system built on trade routes and connections that tragically fueled the slave trade. But it also led to the exchange of goods, culture, and ideas between continents.
A mixed bag for sure. Fascinating to see how these seemingly unrelated things, wanting spices, finding new sea routes, and discovering a new continent, all came together to create such a powerful and ultimately devastating system.
It's a reminder that history is complex, and everything is connected in ways we don't always expect. But now, let's bring it back to sugar.
Right. What happened to those sugar plantations once slavery was finally abolished? How did the industry survive?
That's the big question. It was a huge challenge for plantation owners. They needed workers, and in some places, like the Caribbean, they turned to a new system, indentured labor.
So instead of slaves, they brought in workers from other countries.
Yes, from places like India and China. These workers signed contracts, but the conditions were often harsh, and they were still being exploited.
Not slavery, but not exactly freedom either.
Exactly. The legacy of colonialism and inequality continued to cast a shadow over the sugar industry. But there were also changes in how sugar was produced.
Like what? Did they modernize things?
Big time. The 19th and 20th centuries saw huge advancements in technology. New machines made planting, harvesting, and refining sugar much more efficient.
So more sugar, cheaper sugar.
You got it. Lower prices meant more people could afford sugar, which led to...
More people eating sugar.
Exactly. It became a staple ingredient all over the world, finding its way into all kinds of processed foods and drinks.
Which brings us to today, where we're dealing with the consequences of all that sugar in our diets.
It's true. We love our sweets, but we're also facing health problems linked to too much sugar.
It's like a love-hate relationship with sugar. We enjoy it, but we also know it can be bad for us.
That's a great way to put it. So, where do we go from here? How do we reconcile sugar's complicated past with its role in our lives today?
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been exploring the fascinating and, at times, pretty disturbing history of sugar. It's amazing how something so common has such a complex story behind it.
It really is. And despite all the issues we've talked about, sugar is still everywhere. It's a huge part of our diets, our economies, even our cultures.
So let's pick up where we left off. We were talking about the end of slavery. How did the sugar industry change after that? What happened to those plantations that used to depend on slave labor?
Well, the abolition of slavery meant a huge shift. Plantation owners had to scramble to find new sources of labor.
Because they still needed to produce sugar, right? The demand didn't just disappear.
Exactly. In some places, like the Caribbean, they turned to indentured laborers. People came from places like India and China to work on those plantations.
Indentured laborers.
Huh.
That's kind of like a contract, right? But not really free labor.
Right. These workers signed contracts, but often the conditions were really tough. They were still being exploited, even if it wasn't outright slavery.
So it's a step away from slavery, but not a huge leap towards fair labor practices.
Exactly. The sad truth is that colonialism and inequality continued to affect the sugar industry. But it wasn't all bad news. There were also some positive changes happening.
Like what?
Technology. The 19th and 20th centuries saw some major advancements in how sugar was produced.
So they found ways to make more sugar more efficiently.
Absolutely. New machines streamline everything from planting and harvesting to refining.
I bet those innovations made a big difference in how much sugar was available and probably the price, too.
You got it. Mass production and new tech meant cheaper sugar. And when something gets cheaper,
More people buy it.
exactly. Sugar became a staple ingredient for people all over the world. It wasn't just for special occasions anymore.
And that's when we really see sugar finding its way into all sorts of processed foods and drinks, which is where we are today.
Right. And now we're dealing with the consequences of all that sugar in our
It's
diets.
like a double-edged sword, isn't it? We love the taste of sugar, but we also know it can be bad for us if we have too much.
It's a tricky situation. So the question is, where do we go from here? How do we balance our love of sugar with the need to be healthy and responsible?
That's a big question. What are your thoughts?
I think it starts with awareness. We need to understand sugar's history, both the good and the bad, and how it's still impacting us today.
We need to be smart about our choices,
Yeah.
right? Think about what we're eating and where our food comes from.
Absolutely. And we can go even further. We can support companies that treat their workers fairly. We can advocate for policies that protect workers' rights.
Because those issues of exploitation are still happening in the sugar industry today, right?
Unfortunately, yes. The descendants of those indentured laborers we talked about may still be facing challenges. So it's about making choices that align with our values, both for our health and for the well-being of others.
It's not just about what we eat. It's about how that food is produced. It's about systemic change.
You got it. We need to address the root causes of inequality that are still affecting the sugar industry.
It's a powerful reminder that even something as simple as sugar can be connected to these bigger global issues.
It really is. It shows how seemingly ordinary objects can have these hidden histories, these ripple effects that we don't always see. The next time you reach for a sugary treat, take a moment to think about the journey it took to get there.
A journey marked by innovation, exploration, exploitation, and change. It's a fascinating and thought-provoking story, full of lessons about human nature, our choices, and the impact we have on the world.
It's a story that continues to unfold.
It definitely does. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the history of sugar. We hope you enjoyed the journey and learned something new along the way. Thanks for joining us.